Martha Stewart was America's first self-made billionaire. She built an empire on the back of her media career, even gaining the name the definitive American woman of our time. She changed American life forever. She was the star of TV and excited millions for over 40 years. But not everything was pure and honest with Stewart. She was directly involved in a sinister plot to game the system and prove to the world that the rich can get away with anything. The events that took place would shock the world, put her behind bars, and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. To understand the dramatic fall and scandal of an American icon, we need to take it all the way back to New Jersey, August 3rd, 1941. Martha Stewart had an easy life growing up. She had more advantages than any normal person too. While you were running around your yard playing with sticks, a 10-year-old Stewart had a craving for money and started her business. Her business skills and connections from early life would later set her up for success. The elites of society tended to gravitate towards her personality even at a young age. Future Hall of Fame New York Yankees like Mickey Mantle and Yogi Berra paid Stewart to babysit their children. She developed a keen sense of logistics while babysitting by organizing and throwing parties for the children she looked after. This was only the beginning for Stewart. At only 15 years old, she landed her first TV appearance for Unilever. This commercial would lead her towards a wider portfolio of TV and magazine appearances. Some of these ads even helped pave her way through college. The most notable job she had while attending college was fashion modeling for Chanel at $50 an hour, which is insanely good even for rates nowadays. Chanel's brand is worldwide and now valued at around $15 billion. This shows how well Stewart was connected even at a young age. During her college years, she met and married Yale Law School graduate Andrew Stewart. This would later prove to be a major driving force in her ascent to superstardom. She would have no idea of the impact of this decision until almost a decade later. Both Martha and Andrew Stewart began their entrepreneurial ventures in different directions between 1967 and 1977. Martha had many jobs after college, but being a stockbroker would foreshadow her worst life decision ever. She failed as a stockbroker, so she transitioned into a catering business. Andrew, on the other hand, had founded his own publishing company. He even served as a chief executive for several other publishing houses. He even put himself in the best places to develop Martha as an author. Meanwhile, Martha had a falling out with her catering business co-founder shortly after their business started to become successful. This led to Martha buying out her partner's equity stake in a business that would go on to be worth millions. And this was the start of a long history of her being difficult to work with. Around the same time that her catering business was booming, Martha was hired as a manager to a gourmet food store called the Market Basket. One day she got into an argument with the owners at the mini mall and was removed from her position. She took this opportunity to open up shop somewhere else. All of these experiences of success and failure for the better part of a decade prepared her for the moment that would change her life forever. While Martha was busy with her own business, her husband Andrew had ascended to the position of president at a major New York City publisher called Harry N. Abrams. Then in 1977, he contacted Martha to cater a release party for a top-selling book. Who Martha would meet there laid the foundation for everything she would build the decades afterwards. But this, unfortunately, would also lead to her collapse. She met a guy named Alan Merkin, head of Crown Publishing Group. Martha left a great impression on him, and he praised her for her talents as a chef and hostess. After this party, Alan reached out to Martha with a crazy idea. For the next several years, Martha, with the help of a ghostwriter, would write her first ever cookbook, Entertaining. Entertaining was published in 1982 to a roaring success. The boost in her popularity skyrocketed in the 80s. She released over 10 books during the period of this time, authored dozens of newspaper columns, magazine articles, and made TV appearances on The Oprah Winfrey Show and Larry King Live. But success came with a cost. In 1987, Martha and Andrew separated, then divorced in 1990. Now, the man who helped her start, the father of her child, and partner for over 20 years is gone. She was devastated in a way we wouldn't know until much later. And at this point, she focused heavily on her career, which was exploding. Despite the divorce, she was about to enter a new realm of success. She was one decision away from becoming America's first ever self-made female billionaire. In the same year as her divorce, she signed a publishing deal with Time Publishing Ventures and created a magazine in her name. The magazine was called Martha Stewart Living. She served as the editor-in-chief and released the first issue in late 1990. Martha Stewart Living would dominate for many years and would eventually eclipse more than 2 million copies per issue. But her magazine wasn't the only media taking over the US. Her show, called Martha Stewart Living, yes, the same as her magazine, had a very successful run from 1993 to 2004. Combining this with many appearances on NBC's Today Show, CBS's The Early Show, and other primetime specials, made her a massive fortune. But nothing would build her wealth as much as what came next. Despite nearly 30 years of written and televised media, Stewart never really owned her brand. This is common practice today. In order to get funding or exposure to promote a product, person, or brand, something is usually sacrificed. That sacrifice is a payment to the other party that's fulfilling your needs. The rights to use and own the media is given away to the publishing companies in order to gain access to their extensive exposing and funding. This is why in 1997, Stewart and her business partner Sharon Patrick were intent on buying the rights back to her media. With Patrick's help, they managed to buy everything back and consolidate into one company named Martha Stewart Living Omni Media. This would end up being the defining moment in Stewart's lifelong media career. In a similar way to her ex-husband many years before, she was now a chief executive, except this time of her own company. She held the roles of CEO, president, and chairwoman. While Patrick became the chief operations officer, once Stewart's brand was all under one roof and in her control, she quickly released everything on her websites and started several more ventures. She had accomplished everything there was to accomplish as an entrepreneur and media mogul, except one thing. There was only one goal left, a goal that only a handful of people in the world achieved, and she would be the first female to do it from scratch in America. On October 19, 1999, Martha Stewart Living Omni Media was listed on the New York Stock Exchange as a public company. The initial stock price was set at $18 per share and rallied to $38 by the end of that trading day. It was this very moment that turned Martha Stewart into a billionaire on paper, and even though the share price did go down to $16 per share by February 2002, Stewart was truly on top of the world at this moment. She was dominant in her authority because she controlled 96% of the voting power. That kind of power and momentum can build up an expectation of invincibility. The spotlight had been shining on Stewart for decades now. Nothing put a stain on her empire. All seems perfect, too perfect. And that's because it was. Little did Stewart know, she was about to make one decision that would lead to an earthquake and take down more than half of her wealth, send her to prison, and damage her reputation forever. In 2001, a pharmaceutical company by the name of ImClone Systems were working on a cure and treatment for colorectal cancer. But for years leading up to 2001, they were developing a drug called Erbitux. They filed for FDA approval later that year. They felt confident that their hard work would be rewarded. With an approval from the FDA, the drug would hit the shelves and bring billions to their company. At least that was the idea for 99% of workers at ImClone Systems. But not everyone believed the drug would meet FDA approval. The night before the FDA's big decision, numerous executives across the company sold millions of dollars in shares. The founder, Samuel D. Wakshaw, knew ahead of the decision that Erbitux would not be approved. After telling multiple members of his family to sell theirs, Wakshaw was arrested in 2002 for insider trading. Insider trading is when you have secret information that normal people don't, but you profit in the stock market because of it. It promotes an unfair advantage towards the insiders. If you are an executive at a company and know a major event is going to happen, you need to wait until that information is available to everyone before deciding what to do with your shares. Wakshaw broke this law by telling his family prematurely to sell their shares with information only a select few could have known. Wakshaw ended up with a 7-year prison sentence because of this, and he wasn't the only person to go to jail. Not only did the executives of ImClone know about the impending FDA decision, but so did people close to Martha Stewart. She invested upwards of $230,000 into ImClone by this point. Her broker, Peter Bokanovic, leaked information to Stewart that told her ImClone's price is going to drop soon and to get out. He told her that Samuel Wakshaw was selling his shares for the same reasons. She knew Sam personally and knew the Wakshaw family used Bokanovic as their broker just like her. Stewart went into a panic. She quickly told her broker's assistant to sell her shares immediately so she didn't lose over $230,000. Of course, that's not much to a billionaire, but the money was the least of her problems. If convicted of insider trading, then she will pay with more than just money. She will be at the mercy of the courts to determine her time behind bars, and then at the mercy of the inmates. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, also known as the SEC, announced that Stewart avoided a loss of $45,673 after receiving insider information. The SEC stated that she did this the day before the FDA declined approval for the new ImClone drug Erbitux. Because this information was not publicly available at the time, they saw this as suspicious and started to build a case against Stewart. This backlash was just the beginning. All sides of her business started to evaporate one by one. The media, who were once staunch supporters of her business ventures and brand, were now at her throat. She headlined plenty of magazines and newspapers for months, including appearing on the front cover of Newsweek with the headline, "Martha's Mess." Whenever she appeared on TV, she was blasted and ridiculed for trying to cheat the system. The criticism was coming from all angles. One of the worst TV moments in her life was in 2002 on The Early Show. Stewart was busy fixing a salad when CBS anchor Jane Clayson interrogated her about the ImClone incident. Stewart was enraged, but kept the fury inside despite being pushed into a corner. She snapped back at the CBS anchor, "I want to focus on my salad." She stayed quiet and continued to cook until the show was over. The criticism was boiling over and it showed. Just a few months after being called out on live TV, she was pressured to resign from her position on the board of directors for the New York Stock Exchange. After over a year of investigating and building a case against Stewart, she was formally indicted on June 4, 2003 by a grand jury. She and her broker, Peter Brikonovic, were indicted on 9 criminal counts. This became the final straw, and likely due to the pressure, Stewart resigned from her positions of CEO and chairwoman of Martha Stewart Living Omni Media. She retained her position of chief creative officer and still had majority control over the company and voting rights. Stewart made it clear just one day after the indictment that she would not go down without a fight. She held up an ace in her sleeve, one she's been building for 40 years. Now, she was finally ready to use it. Stewart built an empire appealing to the common people. She gave advice on how to cook, clean, and live life if she was just an average person herself. She influenced millions of people, and in an age without social media, that is incredibly impressive. Stewart knew that she had built a strong following and used this to her advantage. The day after she was indicted, she paid for a full-page advertisement in a prominent newspaper, USA Today, pleading her innocence. She pleaded not guilty for the indictment, and also it was during this ad where she doubled down on a message to her audience. She said, "To my friends and loyal supporters, I want you to know that I am innocent, and that I will fight to clear my name. The government's attempt to criminalize these actions makes no sense to me. I'm confident I will be exonerated of these baseless charges." Stewart pulled her audience into the fight by proclaiming her innocence. She called out the government for unfair and illogical smearing of her name in a matter that she was not involved in. Her ad and outreach fired up her friends and fan base, who sent more than 1,500 letters to the judge from across the country. Stewart also claimed to have over 140,000 emails of support since her trial started. The trial lasted 6 weeks, where there was constant reports and updates from news stations. This was a massively important and high-profile event in the US. Someone with the statue of Martha Stewart could be reduced to nothing but an inmate at a local penitentiary. Millions of people were not ready for that outcome. Stewart was facing jail time as high as 10 years for just one of her 9 criminal counts. The extravagant life that she was used to was about to be stolen away from her. No more lavish vacations to other countries, no more dinner parties. The only fashion she would enjoy now would be an orange jumpsuit, but only if she got charged to the worst crime on her indictment. She was fighting jail time that would chain her down for 10 years and cost $1 million if she was convicted of securities fraud. The Federal Bureau of Investigation describes securities fraud as criminal activity that can include high-yield investment fraud, pyramid schemes, broker embezzlement, and late-day trading. Insider trading falls into this category because by knowing what an investment will do, you will gain an inherent advantage above everyone else. This allows someone to manipulate their chances of winning and losing. But here's the catch. Stewart was not being charged with this exact crime. Instead, James Comey, the professional prosecutor behind the Stewart case, wanted to charge her with market manipulation, which could carry a harsher penalty. Comey claimed that Stewart was using her platform to claim innocence for the intent of boosting her company's stock price. More specifically, she was prosecuted for having misled people by denying having committed a crime, with which she was not charged. Because Stewart was being accused of such a serious crime, the judge deliberated on it first. The outcome is one you won't expect. Stewart's trial finally began on January 20th, 2004, in New York City under U.S. District Judge Miriam Cederbaum's supervision. After hearing arguments for over a month, Cederbaum proclaimed, "No reasonable juror can find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant lied for the purpose of influencing the market for the securities of her own company." Stewart reached her first big break in the legal process with this ruling. There simply wasn't enough proof that Stewart was trying to boost her company through denying the guilt in such a public manner. The response from Stewart to having charges pressed against her was not seen as an attempt to boost her net worth, but rather in retaliation towards the situation as a whole. However, the rest of the charges would go in a different direction and lead to the fall of an American icon. After a grueling 6-week trial, on March 5, 2004, Stewart, despite claiming for nearly a year to be innocent, was found completely guilty of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of making false statements to a federal investigator. This devastated not just the crowd in the courtroom, but also the thousands of media and fans that were just feet outside the courtroom doors. But there was one person who remained stoic while the ruling was handed out by the jury. According to witnesses in the courtroom at the time, Martha Stewart remained stoic and emotionless upon hearing the announcement, but something snapped in her by the time the jury read her verdicts. She hurried out of the courtroom doors with a blank expression and walked right through the media, begging for a second of her time. She walked past thousands of fans lined up at police barricades screaming praises at her, all the way until she got into an SUV and rode away. She did all of this while a juror read the verdict aloud to a sea of cameras. The crowd fell silent as the juror read the charges and convictions on the courthouse steps. Stewart retreated to her daughter's loft nearby and soon after made a new post to the website before taking it down only a few hours later. Here's what she said. "Obviously distressed by the jury's verdict, but I continue to take comfort in knowing that I have done nothing wrong. I will appeal the verdict and continue to fight to clear my name. I believe in the fairness of the judicial system and remain confident that I will ultimately prevail." Stewart keeps doubling down on her innocence, but it's becoming increasingly more difficult to believe, especially after all the evidence is laid out in the open. She received multiple felony convictions by a complete and unbiased jury. Her house of cards is blowing away, and it's all because of 2 people. Stewart would have gotten away with it if these 2 specific people didn't blow the whistle on the whole thing. It only took 2 assistants to shake America to its core. Back at Merrill Lynch, Peter Bogdanovic's assistant got word that ImClone's founder Sam Waxall was selling his shares and telling people to do the same. Knowing that Bogdanovic manages Martha Stewart's money, he called Bogdanovic while he was on vacation. Once he explained what was happening, Bogdanovic blurted out, "Oh my god, get Martha on the phone." He told his assistant to give Stewart a call. That assistant was named Douglas Fanuel. Fanuel pushed back against his boss and asked if relaying the message was appropriate. Bogdanovic replied, "Of course, you must, that's the whole point." It's unclear if Fanuel fully understood what was going to happen, but in the moment he was fearful of his job. He called Stewart and she gave him the go-ahead to sell her shares. Fanuel's sentiment towards the call leaked out later via email he sent to his friend. "I have never ever been treated more rudely by a stranger in my life," he remarked in his email. Stewart had a pattern of lying and being difficult to work with. On the witness stand, Fanuel was calm and collected. He withstood many hours of questioning and cross-examination, often frustrating Stewart's lawyers by his memorized responses. Even when he didn't have a memorized reply prepared, he handled the condescending passive-aggressiveness towards him with class. He was not afraid to speak up for himself when the defense attorney would imply something was incorrect. Fanuel was considered in many headlines as the prosecution's star witness. Fanuel's role in getting Stewart on charges was crucial. Not only did he tip her off in place of Bogdanovic on the initial call, he also is the only reason the prosecution knew Stewart was connected to the insider information. Originally, when speaking with Fanuel, he stuck to the story that Bogdanovic gave him. When a plea deal was offered by the prosecution instead of jail time, he flipped sides and gave up the connection to Stewart. If he had kept his silence or stuck with the original story, prosecutors would have nothing but speculation and a suspicious story between Peter Bogdanovic and Martha Stewart. Fanuel was the missing link for this entire case. Smoking gun. It almost didn't happen though, because of the pressure put on Fanuel by his boss not to say anything. Bogdanovic used sneaky bribes and passive-aggressive tactics to put pressure on his employee. He offered more money, path to promotion, fancy dinners, extra vacation time, and trips around the world like a week in Argentina. Fanuel knew something was up and even asked his boss on one occasion while at a cafe, "Let's talk about the 27th. "I was there, Peter. I know what happened," Fanuel said. Bogdanovic put his hand on Fanuel's shoulder and said, "With all due respect, you don't." There were 2 major aspects of the star witness Fanuel's testimony in court. One of those was debunking the testimonies given by both Stewart and Bogdanovic. Before Manuel blew the whistle, Stewart and Bogdanovic had a few iterations of their cover-up story. The first iteration was in Fanuel's paraphrased testimony of his conversation with Bogdanovic. He said, "The reason for Martha Stewart's sale was tax loss selling. I tried to say something, but I couldn't get a word in edgewise. He cut me off every time. He kept saying the reason for her sale was tax loss selling. He completely ignored me and wouldn't let me speak. Then finally, he finished and there was a silence. 'Okay,' he said. 'Okay?' I said. 'Okay.' Soon thereafter, Fanuel said, Stewart's bookkeeper called and yelled that the ImClone trade totally screwed up Stewart's tax loss selling. I called Peter immediately. I said, 'What is going on?' Again, he began screaming. The reason for this sale is that we came up with a stop-loss order agreement at $60. Again, I couldn't get a word edgewise. After some time had passed, Bacanovic came back to Fenuel and offered him the trip to Argentina. But Fenuel didn't accept. Bacanovic wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page about what the story was. So he said this to Fenuel: "I've spoken with Martha, I've met with her, everyone's telling the same story. It was a $60 stop-loss order. We're all on the same page. It's a true story." Then Bacanovic showed Fenuel the allegedly altered worksheet and said, "Look what I found. See? That's right, a major part of the testimony was the reveal and examination of evidence that Bacanovic had in fact forged a document to prove its point, likely out of desperation. Bacanovic had taken a spreadsheet and wrote a controversial at 60 outside the margins of the table on the side. The government wanted to jump on this opportunity and had tests done on the document. The particular piece of evidence was so controversial, the entire trial was almost thrown out. It took a couple months for Bacanovic and Stewart to get their story straight. They settled on the $60 stop-loss story and then doubled down every time they were asked. After they did, Bacanovic and Stewart both arranged for evidence to be created that would prove their story. On February 14, 2002, on the lead up to the famous trial, Merrill Lynch produces a worksheet of Stewart's holdings with an at 60 notification next to ImClone. The government was not impressed by this worksheet, and closer to the trial date alleges that it was false and fraudulent because the at 60 was added after the fact. Later on in the trial, the government would actually have this document tested in a lab. The circumstances regarding the test were shocking for a number of reasons. Larry Stewart, the chief forensic scientist for the Secret Service, was called upon to examine the document and determine if the ink blots were the same across the paper or if the at 60 was added later. He testified during the trial that the document's famous at 60 notation was in fact different ink compared to the rest of the document and was added later on. At first glance, the testimony sounds like a deliberating injury to the defense. Here was an esteemed forensic scientist proclaiming that the defense had zero actual evidence to prove their claim of a stop-loss agreement between them. One problem, Larry Stewart was not actually there at the time of the examination like he said he was. This was revealed during the cross-examination. It was made clear that he had committed perjury, which ironically is one of the exact crimes that Peter Bacanovic was found guilty of by lying under oath to the court. But it gets worse. Not only was Larry Stewart not at the examinations, he didn't even know about them in the first place until they were finished. We believe that the perjury of a key government witness undermines any integrity there was in the jury's verdict and requires a new trial, and we will pursue that. Stewart, not Martha, was arrested and faces a maximum total of 10 years in prison if convicted. Getting a retrial is a difficult task. Typically, the defense must demonstrate the discovery of new evidence that could have led the jurors to a different verdict. Although this evidence was essential to Bacanovic's making fraudulent documents accusation, throwing out the document would be inconsequential to the trial as a whole. Judge Cedarbaum would not believe that the error committed by the prosecution with their witness testimony would affect the decision of the jury. The defense for Stewart managed to break away from the conclusiveness of the document by tearing apart the perjured witness. Bacanovic benefited the most from this outcome as he was later found not guilty of making and using false documents. While they didn't get a retrial, their efforts would be focused on the validity of Fenuel's testimony. The cross-examination of Fenuel's time on the stand was especially ruthless, calling into question the famed assistant's out-of-work activities. This twist could doom the prosecution, and the defense spared no effort to discredit the star witness. The second important aspect of Fenuel's testimony was the steadfastness in the defense, targeting his drug use and potential workplace impairments. Fenuel was under tremendous pressure to survive the defense's attempts to discredit him, and his ability to perform his job correctly enough to accuse Stewart and Bacanovic. What's interesting is, from the beginning, the prosecution's game plan was for him to be considered an admitted criminal. This means that he was open and honest from the very beginning that he had lied earlier in the process. His first interaction with investigators was very tight-lipped, and he stuck to the stop-loss cover story that his boss told him to. Fenuel admitted that his hesitation to tell the truth was because he was fearful of retaliation from his boss in the company. Despite that fear, when he started his testimony, he did praise his former boss. Peter Bacanovic was the best boss I ever had. It was a great working relationship. He was demanding yet appreciative. On what made him finally tell the truth, I felt that the cover-up had become part of my daily existence. I couldn't take it anymore. Fenuel was solid while on the stand. In an effort to get his testimony completely thrown out, the defense had him go through a gauntlet of questioning about his alleged drug problem. The jury was sent out of the room for the exploration of Fenuel's drug use history, so to not contaminate the relevant details of the case for the jury to decide on. If Judge Cedarbaum decided certain details were relevant, then the jury could be brought back in. For now, the defense needed to prove to Cedarbaum that his history of drug use impaired his ability to do his job correctly. This was the defense's main goal and realistically the only chance to save Bacanovic or Stewart from guilty verdicts. Prior to this day, there had been a growing narrative outside of the courtroom that Fenwell had a drug problem. Fenwell wanted to set the record straight. He explained that the problem amounted to taking ecstasy a few times and smoking pot once a month. Fenwell's testimony wasn't the only testimony that made a lasting impact in the case. Another assistant would soon speak and her testimony would condemn Stewart's character worse than Fenwell's emails. She would expose the lingering possibility that this whole time, Stewart had been lying to her friends and her fans about her innocence. Peter Bacanovic attempted to reach Martha Stewart as soon as possible when he learned that ImClone would be hitting rough waters. For that particular call, he did not get Stewart and instead got her assistant Anne Armstrong. She wrote the details in the call logbook, which read, "Peter Bacanovic thinks ImClone's going to start trading downward." The call was recorded on the exact day Stewart sold her 3,928 shares. Stewart didn't notice the call log until about a month later, which then she replaced the words to "Peter Bacanovic re ImClone." As soon as Armstrong mentioned this, Stewart startled her by immediately telling her in a frantic tone to put it back the way it was. But the damage had already been done. As soon as Stewart attempted to conceal her crime, she committed another one. It does not matter to the court or the jury that she realized and tried to fix it. It was too late. But that only matters if Anne Armstrong decides to speak up and share her accounts of the events. To Stewart's surprise, she did. This piece of testimony and evidence contributed to her later being charged with obstruction of justice. Anne Armstrong's testimony did more than just physical damage to Stewart's case. It also had an effect on the psyche of the jury. Just like with Fenwell, Stewart is being shown in a negative light. She is being shown to have character flaws hiding under the surface that make her actions plausible to the jury, which will help them decide on her guilt. With Fenwell's account, Stewart was shown as an aggressive and rude person. With Armstrong's account, Stewart was shown as a deceptive, plotting, and volatile individual. The desecration of Stewart's once perfect image is not finished yet. There's one witness that hasn't been mentioned yet. This witness is someone close to Stewart. Mariana Pasternak is probably best known for the ultimate heel turn on her very rich and powerful best friend. Pasternak frequently went on vacations with Stewart as part of their friendship. One such vacation happened right outside the initial calls with Peter Bacanovic. It was recalling this memory that shook the court. "Isn't it nice to have brokers who tell you those things?" Stewart said. Stewart was cold and emotionless as her former best friend recalled the events of that vacation. Pasternak wrote a book on her falling out with Martha Stewart some years after the trial, and it's there where we learn a little bit more about the sensitive details of Stewart's personal life. Pasternak was that friend who filled the void after Stewart's divorce from Andy. Throughout the book, Pasternak depicts a competitive, emotional, and somewhat needy Stewart, but their friendship was dead before it even got to the court. And a particular telling example of a moment that made Pasternak realize that their friendship could not continue was some time before the ImClone situation. She remembered a time that her, Stewart, and Sam Waxall were in a helicopter ride and the door blasted open. Waxall was trying to close the door and Pasternak recalled holding onto him so he wouldn't fall out of the helicopter. But when she looked over to Stewart, she could see a person doing nothing but trying to figure out how to protect herself. It was then that she understood the limits of their relationship and separated. Not long after, the ImClone insider trading scandal occurred. Despite all the testimony against Stewart, she still managed to avoid the worst charges, the primary one being securities fraud. She pleaded her innocence every step of the way. Her helicopter friend Sam Waxall didn't get the same treatment. His actions would define ImClone for years to come. Before the famous Martha Stewart trial, Sam Waxall had been sent to jail for 7 years for a number of crimes, but specifically the one that Stewart avoided, securities fraud. But this wasn't the only time Waxall put his company in jeopardy. A congressional hearing on ImClone revealed a history of corruption dating back to 1986, back when Waxall forged the signature of the company's general counsel, John Lands, for financial gain. Lands defended Waxall's illegal actions as a good faith misunderstanding in front of a government committee. More investigations revealed additional Waxall forgeries, but it also showed a culture of negligent reporting and compliance. The chief legal officer and the company's outside directors knew he was doing this but never tried to remove him as CEO. An internal investigation was opened but never finished, which means they were likely protecting him. He got out of prison in 2009 and held interviews explaining how he passed the time. He wrote memoirs about his life before and after the ImClone incident. Although Sam Waxall told others close to him, like his father Jack and his daughter Aliza, to sell their shares, he reached a plea deal that protected them from indictment. Even after everything that happened, Sam Waxall came out on top. His company was bought by pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly for $6.5 billion in 2008. In a previous investment deal with a different company, Bristol Myers, Sam Waxall made off with more than $50 million on a $2 billion total deal. So it stands to reason that he probably made at least triple that as a nice getting out of jail present. Without his leadership and the years of prison time, Erbitux ended up becoming quite successful and eventually helped millions of cancer patients. Sam said in an interview that he and Martha Stewart keep their distance, but he still considers her an important old friend. Martha Stewart's post-jail life seemed to rebound nicely. She only spent 5 months in prison for her crimes. She spent most of the time working as an informal liaison between the administration and her fellow inmates. The rest of her sentence contained a 2-year supervised release. In her first 5 months, she had to be on house arrest. After the 5 months of being monitored, she was required to go back to work while not associating with people who had criminal records. In order to leave the jurisdiction of the United States District Court in New York, she needed to receive permission from federal officials. Just like Sam Waxall, Stewart, upon leaving prison, went back to her entrepreneurial roots and got heavily invested in new media opportunities, picking up right where she left off. In 2005, she started her comeback tour on a big way by creating The Martha Stewart Show. During her nearly 20-year post-prison career, she appeared and starred on numerous shows. Some notable ones include Food Network's Chopped and Bakeaway Camp with Martha Stewart. She also created and hosted an HGTV show called Martha Knows Best. She made her jump to newer platforms like Roku with Martha Cooks, Martha Gardens, and Martha Holidays. Even outside of the ridiculous TV schedule commitments, she managed to find a time to publish a whopping 43 more books. She also launched a line of CBD products and made history in 2023 for becoming the oldest woman to appear on the cover of Sports Illustrated Swimsuit Edition. And this was at the age of 81. Martha Stewart is still a tremendously active entrepreneur and hasn't slowed down even in her 80s. She spoke to People in May 2023 and said there's no reason to retire. When asked about taking time off, she said, "That's not what my life is about. My life is about doing things and learning things and teaching things." It's true that Martha Stewart has kept up her incredible work ethic even in her 80s. But the last big life-defining milestone she hit occurred in 2015. In a full-circle moment worth millions of dollars, she finally decided to sell her multimedia empire, Martha Stewart Living Omnimedia. It was purchased for $353 million by a food conglomerate called Sequential Brands. Since Stewart was majority shareholder, she would have likely made around $50 million from the purchase alone. Stewart is in the twilight of her life and career, and at one point was worth over $1 billion before her insane demise that sent her and many others to jail. A string of poor decisions stunted what could have been one of the greatest professional careers ever in the US. Instead of selling her company for a few $100 million, she likely could have sold her company for billions of dollars. But the hit on her reputation did incredible harm despite her light prison time. Both Sam Waxall and Stewart ended up on top in the end because they were willing to use their power and influence to game the system at every opportunity, and that will be a large stain on their respective histories. There was a way, at least for Stewart, to get out of this entire mess with no prison time. If she had done this one simple thing, then all she would have had to deal with is a fine in the several $100,000 range, but to a billionaire that would be pretty easy to deal with, especially if it would have kept her out of prison and kept her public image secure. All Martha Stewart had to do was tell the truth. The continued lying, the obstruction of evidence, the concealment, these were the reasons why she was charged with prison time instead of just a fine. The ImClone incident will forever be a warning to the rich and powerful to think carefully about their approach to making money. Because if you cut too many corners, you may find yourself being called into a courtroom or jail.